Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davich. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, the DeKalb Library Foundation, and Georgia Poetry in the Parks, welcome to a poetry reading entitled, I'm Not a Nature Poet, But, in celebration of the Georgia Poetry in the Parks program. Just a few words before we begin tonight's formal presentation. If you would like to ask a question after all of our panelists have spoken, you can use the Q&A feature. You'll find the Q&A feature at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. If you click that button, you can type in the question there. Also, for our hearing impaired patrons, we have enabled live transcription. You can find the CC button at the top or bottom of your device, and when you click on it, you can resize the font to make it easier to read for you. I would also like to direct your attention to a few programs we have coming up this week. We have a wonderful program with two poets coming up for our On My Mind series that we host with the South Carolina Center for the Book. That will be on Thursday, and you can find the event to register on Eventbrite. You can also find out more about our forthcoming programs all summer long at georgiacenterforthebook.org. And because we'll be talking about our new program, Georgia Poetry in the Parks, I encourage you to look up georgiapoetryintheparks.org. The links will be in the chat, and if you do find it easier to leave a question there, we will be monitoring that as well at the end of the program. Right now, I would like to introduce you to our host for our program this evening, Chelsea Rathburn. She is a poet and currently serves as the Georgia Poet Laureate. Her collections include Still Life with Mother and Knife, the most recent, which was placed on the Books All Georgians Should Read list, and previously, A Raft of Grief and The Shifting Line. I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea now, and she is going to tell you a little more about our poets and about this wonderful new poetry program that we came up with during the pandemic. Chelsea?
All right, thank you, Joe. Thank you for being here with us tonight to celebrate three Georgia poets I'm really excited about. I love their work. And thank you to Joe Davich and Ali Stonewright at the Georgia Center for the Book. They are just really terrific people to collaborate with. Essentially, we came up with this idea about a year ago of placing poetry trails, basically poems by Georgia poets on signs, putting them directly in the path of ordinary Georgians, out enjoying the outdoors. This came about partly when, at the height of the pandemic, when I was stuck in my house and also spending a lot of time just, wandering around my neighborhood and seeing all of my neighbors, escaping isolation by going outside. And we thought, gosh, what a wonderful way to help maybe people who don't think of themselves as poetry readers, to give them the opportunity to just encounter poems out in the wild and maybe have their minds opened or changed by the poems that they read, change their ideas about poetry at least. So when I started collaborating with Georgia Center for the Book, basically we were gathering poems that we all knew and loved, but we also began reaching out to poets and describing this project. And I would explain to writers and say, well, we're not really looking necessarily for, a poem about Georgia or set in Georgia. Maybe we're not necessarily looking for a poem about the seasons or about the state bird or anything like this. Simply, so, I'm looking for poems that would offer park goers a moment of reflection and maybe even a little bit of wonder. And everybody that I contacted was really enthusiastic. It was really great. It's always wonderful to, reach out to somebody and say, hey, I saw this poem in a magazine and it is perfect, or I love this poem from your book. Can we include it? So everybody was really, really enthusiastic, but there were two comments that kept coming up again and again, the same two comments. And one was, quote, my work tends to be a little bit darker than what I think you have in mind for a project like this. And the second was, I'm not a nature poet, but ... I'm not a nature poet, but I'll see if I have anything that might fit. And a few cases it was, I'm not a nature poet, but I'll try to write something for you, which is very cool. So to be honest, I'm not a nature poet, but I get it. Most of my poems that directly involve nature actually are about natural disasters. Like Hurricane Andrew ripped through my childhood home with my family inside in 1992. My other nature poems, tend to end with me, outdoors and then retreating indoors, usually being pursued by some kind of venomous creature or something with teeth, right? So I'm definitely in the I'm not a nature poet camp. But all of these sort of this comment coming up again and again just got me thinking, wouldn't it be interesting, to get a group of poets together and talk about this? To, what is our resistance, if we have resistance to the idea of nature poetry? What are the challenges of writing about nature? What do we do with writing about the future in the face of extreme climate change? So this was sort of how this event tonight came about. We have gathered 3 incredible poets, all of whom are featured on the spring poetry trails of Georgia Poetry in the Parks. So if you go out to Arabian Mountain or the Michelle Obama Trail this spring, you will encounter their poems in the wild. But right now, I am going to just share a little bit about each of them. I'll introduce each one, all 3, and then they will just read without further interruptions from me. And then after they read, we'll have time for a conversation. As Joe Davich mentioned, if you have questions that you want to put in the Q&A, that would be lovely. So our first reader will be going alphabetically. Our first reader is Diamond Forde. Diamond Forde's debut collection, Mother Body, won the 2019 Saturnalia Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the 2022 Kate Tufts Discovery Award. And if you know the poetry world, that is a huge, huge deal. A Callaloo and 10 House Fellow, Forde attended the University of West Georgia as an undergraduate and ultimately earned a PhD at Florida State University. Her works appeared in Boston Review, Honey Literary, Obsidian, Massachusetts Review, and many other journals. After Diamond, we will hear from Sean Hill. Born and raised in Milledgeville, Sean Hill is the author of 2 poetry collections, Dangerous Goods and Blood Ties and Brown Liquor, named one of the 10 books all Georgians should read in 2015 by the Georgia Center for the Book. Hill has received numerous awards, including fellowships from Cave Canem, the Bush Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. A former Stegner Fellow at Stanford University, he's taught at several colleges, including Georgia Southern University as an assistant professor. And he currently lives in Montana with his family. And it's moments like this that make me grateful for Zoom, for the ability to draw these writers who are no longer living in Georgia, bring them back virtually is really wonderful. So finally, our third reader will be Christina Olson. And Cristina lives and writes in Statesboro. She is the author of the book Terminal Human Velocity, and her chapbook, The Last Mastodon, won the Rattle 2019 chapbook contest. Other work appears in The Atlantic, The Nation, The Normal School, Scientific American, Virginia Quarterly Review, and The Best Creative Nonfiction. And she is an associate professor at Georgia Southern University. So now that you know a little about them all, what you're really going to discover is just what unbelievable poets they are. They're fantastic. Please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to our first reader, Diamond Forde.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for that introduction, for organizing with Georgia Center for the Book. This is wild. I'm really joyful and excited and terrified to be here. I'm not a nature poet, but I'm really interested in landscapes, particularly thinking about the landscape of the body. I mean, I'm a fat Black woman, right? And I'm constantly thinking about how fatness can kind of intersect with poetics. And so in that way, I've been thinking about the body as this big, expansive landscape. How do I try to contain it within the poem? And I think part of that work has kind of branched a little bit. And these days I'm writing about nature a lot. Right? But I'm still trying to kind of do a little bit of that stitching, thinking about how this kind of natural world that we live in can intersect with the landscape of the Black body, right? Anyway, so somehow I'm not a nature poet, but I managed 5 poems for you, right? And I'm gonna get into those now. These poems are thinking about recentering Black women in the larger narrative of the King James Bible, right? So you'll hear a lot of really kind of religious or biblical overtones, not undertones, overtones, right? That's purposeful, I swear, right? All right, so this first poem, The Flood. Listen, this how the world began. Woman hooked an ankle on the Milky Way, dug her toes in Sirius's ribs, hooked an arm round Ryan's belt and pushed, and a clot blobbed into the universe, darkness nibbling its endometrial ends to globe. Woman eased the mortal jolt from a bare womb, rivers born from rivulets of blood, branches flushed with blood fruit, crow's wings, thunder and they black, black, blood, 40 days and 40 nights, woman poured to the earth, bold, sloshing its animal. And on the 40th night, blanketed with a need to sleep, woman cramped an earthquake, hooked her finger to rife out a wet human howl. Then the world was born from nothing? A woman ain't nothing, if not a miracle worker. See, I once spit cornmeal and cast iron, fed the town for weeks, quilted warm nights from a ball of yarn, took a seed smaller than the slivered moon of your fingertips, buried it in peatland, and from it a whole sassafras sprouted, tall as the beard of God, and each fall the red leaves smeared over autumn like a bloody rainbow. So this project is largely centered around my grandmother. So the voice that kind of occupied that last poem is definitely my grandmother, right? And now we got a whole new voice for you coming up, right? So we're hopefully familiar with like the story of Noah's flood, right? And I'm thinking about marginalized characters that get erased in this project, and me and my obsession with fatness. I'm like, yo, what would it be like to be a pig on Noah's Ark? So the sow speaks to Noah. And what should I think of this? Mercy? In a near month languishing on a boat gone nowhere. The tusk and musk of livestock, gassy camels, chickens that flick wet flecks of shit, giraffes and they long necks forever knocking somebody flat on their asses. Never mind the sheep bleating all night and that somebody stay watching me piss, eat, or sleep, reminding me I'm the voice of a generation, as if that should make me humble. As if that might make me forget that the only sky you've given me is a puddle snagged on the sharp edge of candlelight. It can't be a journey that takes you from home and never gives you back. Is it a gift that I've survived to send my kids to slaughter? Better home is the mouth of their mother. Yes, I will eat my children before I let their buttocks butter into fat back. Better to gore through the next soft meat, unseed my children, chestnuts rendered free, their spirits you can't digest. And this ain't the last flood, Noah. Your generations drown my kin in white noise daily. But did you know a pig can swim for miles if it gotta? And I breed often, turn my whole ass out to open ocean, kick a tremolo of waves behind. My whole brood finna wash this planet. Maidens of mud, when the water done making slop of the earth, we will root in raw dung, kick wherever our pink hooves please, outnumber the men who penned us here, feed to our bellies, bulge into boulders, be too large for any hook to hold us. Poem in which I should write about Cain, but I'm tired of writing about death. So instead, a houseplant, arching a trellis of its own strong stems, elephant ear, colocasia, what my aunt called Alice, Ready for the sure mothering of her own mother, she tended Alice with the surgical heed of a woman seeming silver to the sharp ends of the moon. And even when she yelled at us for crawling through the jungle mess of Alice's large leaves scattered soil so far, she'd find perlite wedged inside the treadmill. Sometimes she'd let me water or cull the gold and ghostly curls of a dying sprout hung like a wrung out washcloth. And in my hands, she saw a potential to dig, to muck deep into the manure of my imagination, to sprout offshoots I'll plant in someone else someday when I am not afraid to think of myself as a god large enough that every heart-shaped leaf dicing light to dust could beat in my own chest. And I've never made a life, but I've reached into the refuse they make of our chests, found hearts hardy as crocus bulbs, and in this poem, I will plant a world for girls where kudzu climbs and is wanted. So again, a lot of these poems feature my grandmother as a character. My grandmother's name is Alice, right? So when you hear Alice, that's what I'm talking about. Thank you so much for holding down with me. I have 2 more poems left. This is Without Hunger. In my bedroom in Alabama, a cry bullies the night below my window. So I open my front door for just a peek. Expect to see a stray cat linked to me by porch light. Instead, 2 coyotes, backs dipping like rowboats over the red waves of a mangled fox. They freeze when they see me. I do too. All our hearts clapped to the back of our throats. I smell hunger as it hackles their cages, but they scatter and I inch back into my home, hear the fox thud to the mulch fur, glassy with blood like a pond's bruised rind. I wait for the thump to stop drumming inside me, promise my gore pit I won't eavesdrop on insatiable gods anymore. But the body can't mumble long without hunger, which is to say, I went out again, gluttoned my eyes on the fresh bones guttered in the yard. And maybe the coyotes scared because of this, my thirst to drink the night of all its dead things, the stars, envious, dead, waiting for someone to mourn them. What I should have said when you asked me if I'd go to grandma's funeral. You tell me I'm selfish. It's true. I'm particular too. Toast my bread on one side, pluck my toenails in my plush down bed, sneeze and shout so loud our small hound slumbers with an eye transfixed on the pollen pilling the sill. And martyrdom, that supposed mechanism of motherhood, won't tick in me. But there's a fig tree feathering behind the old brick building at work, and each fall it droops with newborn fruit, green bulbs purpling like bruises, flush with fresh meat seeds, pink as flagging tongues, and there's a cove cratered beneath the broadleaves, large enough to sit in, to reach for every wine dark drop, eat, cream its custard against my teeth. And isn't it divine to hide behind fig leaves? Or that for each fruit to bloom, a mother dies, a wasp slipping into the fig's snug end, wings clipped in entry, antennae ripped from their stalks, blinded by a need to breed, which is not a metaphor, just an insect giving body for brood, because love is a force greater than grief. And we weren't meant to mother, but I know love. Found it in the joyful tunes of my own breath, and my hands clapping verbs to thunder, and my thighs singular notes. And maybe if you'd listen, you hear it as my grandmother heard it in her last pulse, that thrum, not swan song, but a mulch womb buzzing to fruit. Thank you.
Good evening. I want to thank Chelsea Rathburn for inviting me to be a part of this series, Poetry in the Park, and this reading tonight, and Allie Stonewright and everyone else who helped put this together. Thank you, Joe. I want to thank Diamond for those poems, those incredible, wonderful poems. Yeah, you're taking me back to back to Georgia, out here from Montana. Thank you. And Alice, I was like, yeah, I remember that elephant ear plant too. My grandma had one. Yeah, and thinking about bringing outdoors inside and all these things, yes, thank you. And I'm so excited to hear Christina's poem, so I probably shouldn't take too long. Huge fan of Christina Olson's. So I want to read a few poems. I'm going to start with this poem. It's titled The White-Headed Woodpecker, and it was a poem that the editors of Cascadia, a new sort of forthcoming literary field guide, asked me to write. They're like, hey, can you write about this bird, the white-headed woodpecker? I like birds. I like looking at birds. And they knew this about me. And so like, hey, what can you do with this bird? I didn't know what I could do with the bird, but I thought about where it lived and where I'd been, and how those things overlapped, and how those things sort of touched on history too. So here we go, The White-Headed Woodpecker. Quiet, given to prying more than pecking, an odd member of the family, lives only in the high pine forests of western mountains like the Cascades, where I spent an afternoon almost a decade ago in Roslyn, Washington, looking for what I could find of Black people who'd migrated from the South almost a century and a quarter prior. The white-headed woodpecker doesn't migrate, and so is found in its home range year-round when it can be found. Roslyn, founded as a coal mining town, drew miners from all over Europe, as far away as Croatia, across the ocean, with opportunities. With their hammering and drilling to extract a living, woodpeckers could be considered arboreal miners. A habitat, a home range, is where one can feed and house oneself, meet the requirements of life, and propagate. In 1888, those miners from many lands, all in Roslyn, came together to go on strike against the mine management. And so, from southern states, a few hundred Black miners were recruited with the promise of opportunities in Roslyn, many with their families in tow to break the strike. They faced resentment and armed resistance, left in the dark until their arrival. Unwitting scabs, that healing that happens after lacerations or abrasions. Things settled down as they do sometimes. And eventually, Blacks and whites entered a union as equals. Black, save for a white face and crown, and a sliver of white on its wings that flares to a crescent when they spread for flight. The white-headed woodpecker is a study in stark contrasts. Males have a patch of red feathers on the back of their crowns, and I can't help but see blood. So before the people who were editing this anthology contacted me, I was contacted by another anthology. It's kind of a good way to write poems. Like, hey, can you write a poem about this thing? And they were like, hey, we have a list. You can check out this list. We really want you to write a poem for us. In the list, all the cool animals were taken. The lake sturgeon was what was left that I was like, I think I can write a poem about a lake sturgeon. So I sort of moved into what I knew of lake sturgeon, which was very little at the time. I had to do some research to find out a little bit more about them, but I had touched one before I wrote this poem. I was living in Minnesota, went to the aquarium of the Great Lakes. So, lake sturgeon. When you think of fish, if you think of fish, do you think of this fish? If so, do you think of a dish of caviar or the Civil War? For me, these fish bring to mind an elbow or knee, places we bend, where touch is close to the bone. Touch your patella, from the Latin for a small, shallow dish, and this one upside down and covered, skin over bone plate. You get close to the feel of sturgeon with their rows of scutes, starting more like skew than school and ending like boots. Bony plates under their rough brown skin. Since these drab late bloomers don't mate till their teens or even 20s, then only every 3 years or so, do you think stodgy sturgeon? Did you know our appetites took their generations before they could be? Their roe fed an economy for a time in the late 19th century. Long-lived fish, these somber bottom feeders. The males live into our middle age. The females can live to be 150 or so, twice our lifetimes. If fish could talk, I would settle in with one of these antique Tennesseans and ask, if fish had knees, when you were a fry at your father's, how did he explain to you the cries of men at the Battle of Chattanooga? The thud of boots come to rest, the boot thump of rough brogans, the report of rifle and cannon fire, Southern men not bending a knee to keep others in their thrall, claiming generations before they could be, using slave labor to feed the economy, routed on the ridges above your home. What ripples your sky? Did you hear cannon fire for thunderclap and wait for rain? That's what I would ask if fish could talk and I could find one that survived the last century in these southern waters we dammed and sullied. I moved around a bit. I lived in northern Minnesota, lived in Alaska. That's where I met my wife. We decided to start a family, and that's where my son was born. We also traveled a bit, got into California. This poem is about some time we spent in California, in Carmel by the sea. One Saturday morning, it was spring in Carmel. There were birds. It always feels like spring in Carmel. It still felt like deep winter back home in Fairbanks. There were bush tits and band-tailed pigeons, acorn woodpeckers, western scrub jays, and a brown creeper. black phoebes, spotted and California towhees, and a Townsend warblers, and others, and a gull floated high overhead. I stood on the patio in the least layers I'd worn in months. I held you, legs wrapped by my right arm. Between my wrist and elbow, your seat. You'd only recently begun pointing out the living room window at trucks and cars moving along the hard-packed snow on the road back home. There were birds, a whole new community for you. And the American crow on the wire was the largest, and so I thought the easiest for your young eyes to perceive. So I pointed at it, and you pointed with me, with what was surely my hand when I was your age, but your eyes didn't follow our fingers. They looked at me and out and inward, like when we listened to music in the kitchen back home in Fairbanks, with our hands waving in the air. But on the patio, there was no music save birdsong. I pulled my hand back and jabbed at the crow, and we were doing an old disco move. I leaned back with you in my arm and watched your eyes roll down in your head to stay level with the horizon. After a couple of tries, the crow cawed and ruffled its feathers at us, and you discovered it. Oh, your emphatic finger, showing me that there was a crow on the wire, acknowledging that bird, and then others. You revealed not what I knew, that there were birds one Saturday morning in Carmel, but made me feel again how the world opens before a curious body, our bodies. Thank you.
Okay, it's me. Like everyone else, I am incredibly grateful that this came together and to the work that the Georgia Center for the Book and everyone else is doing. So thank you so much. And I'm actually stoked to go last because Diamond, I also have a fig wasp poem. So I just pulled that one up. So I was gonna say like dueling, but that's totally not the spirit. I'm just like, yes, let's keep talking about wasps. That's what I want to say. I'm gonna drop a photo into the chat if you can see it. This first poem is gonna be all about horseshoe crabs, and the short answer or my poetic understanding of what we do is we're able to harvest a chemical from their blood, and their blood is like this beautiful blue. It's like it would be a very trendy color for a cabinet. And anyway, we pull something out of their blood and then we can throw them back in the water. So this one is called Blue Bloods, and there's an epigraph to start it off. In the 1950s, scientists discovered that LAL, or Limulus amoebocyte lysate, a clotting agent found in the horseshoe crab's powder blue blood, binds to fungi and endotoxins, coagulating into a thick gel around such invaders. The result is a simple, surefire way to detect impurities in pharmaceutical drugs and medical supplies. Blue bloods. In Charleston, the horseshoe crabs are captured, folded in half, strapped to stainless steel tables. Hours ago, they were plucked from the beaches too north of Hilton Head to be popular. Now needles drain their blue blood. It's a scene from sci-fi, a movie starring living fossils. Blue because copper, not iron, chills their circulatory system. Clipped to the table, the crabs look like nothing so much as army helmets. The chemical leaked from their hard bodies will be used to check the armed forces' supply of medicine. The blood is drained and spun, and then out comes LAL. Street value is 15 grand a quart. Something borrowed, something blue. If you've ever lain in a hospital bed, IV dangling like a thought, the crab blood vetted that bag. If your father died 2 years ago this month, all the drugs the doctors tried were tested with this cold blood. On ancient vacations, you flipped over all the horseshoes you could find. Once you planted your sandy foot right in one's back. You waited for your father to smack you, but he shrugged, said, "Only crab ain't worth eating." Later, much later in the hospital, you brought him blue crabs you'd boiled in Old Bay and beer. You asked the nurses to look away while you held the meat up to his lips, wiped your freckled hands on the bed sheets. He died anyway. Overhead, though you didn't know it then, the astronauts on the International Space Station reached for drugs made safe by horseshoes. The living fossils will be bumped back to the bay, released and dizzy. They will recover fully, scuttle through silt for another 20 million years. But we can't say the same for the astronauts, or the soldiers, or the cancer kids in the wards, or your father, or you. Our blood runs too red. I'm gonna drop one more photo in the chat if you're interested. It is it is that classic Windows like 2005 or whatever autumn backdrop. And I came across an article where like in 2007, an editor for Vanity Fair was like, I must go find where this photo was taken. Because in 2007, magazines had like budgets for stuff like that. It was really journalism at its finest. Unsurprisingly, it's in Vermont. So I wrote this poem after I moved down to Georgia because I'm originally from Western New York. And I have to say that I love many, many things about Georgia, but the autumn we have down here is not one of those things, especially not in Statesboro, which is outside of Savannah. So this one's called Last Love Letter for Autumn. A quiet lane, a century of sugar maples wearing hunter orange, the perfect weathered barn. Had he asked me, I would have told him, it's nice all of 2 weeks a year. Then comes all the raking, palms red, weeping blisters. Once I thought I was in love with a man in Vermont. We had white sweaters. We drove up Route 9 and ate Bucklerboro. At the North Lake where the monster lives, that pretty college town, we almost convinced ourselves our lives would matter. And now I'll never have to say leaf peeper again, or pretend to like the grit of buckwheat. No more lunches of soft orange soup. Down here where I live now, ladies dress up for football. The men put on belts embossed with dogs and eagles and tigers. The pumpkins slump in 80-degree heat. Trick-or-treating on a beach. You can get used to anything. On the way back from the coast, I see the fields have erupted in cotton. But when I squint, it almost looks like snow. This is who I've become, a person who's like, oh, it must be Thanksgiving. The cotton is in the field. Yeah. I'm just gonna read 2 more for you. I was lucky enough to go out to a Western Science Center at the invitation of a paleontologist friend. And she was like, you can be our poet in residence. And I was like, that sounds amazing. I don't know what that means. And so, but I did it and I touched all the fossils, which is a dream of mine. And then I wrote this little book about the mastodons there. So this mastodon his name is Little Stevie, because of course it is. And he lived 50,000 years ago out in what we now know to be the Inland Empire outside of Los Angeles. It's called Wake Up, Little Stevie. In another dimension, the mastodons are still alive. Their teeth not yet white marble, hard as Venus's breast. And in another dimension, the ocean has not yet receded like a hairline. And the freeway does not yet hold California together like sutures. And the water in Diamond Valley Lake sparkles like nothing because there isn't water, there is no lake. And the mastodons are not hardening in their muddy graves. They are instead pissing and fighting and breathing like you did this morning. And in another dimension, the great tusks are not slumbering in the tar, waiting to be dragged out of the black rock. And in another dimension, you are little Stevie, lumbering in the scrub. And you are not thinking about your death, but rather your dinner. And in another dimension, you are alive. You are alive, not dead. No, never dead. And I'll close out with the wasp one here. I once read this poem like as a draft in progress to a group of students. And at the end, some kid raised his hand and he goes, "One question." I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Why?" And I was like, that is the eternal question, my man. So, you know, either you're a writer and you get it, or maybe you don't. So this is called Fig Wasp. Look, I know how unlikely it is that this American grocery store fig actually contains the remains of that intrepid pollinator, the fig wasp. That crunch of seeds is just that, seeds, plant sex, not a de-winged and dead mother having laid her eggs. But isn't it more fun, more deranged to imagine the crunch is the wasp, that finally teeth have won over sting? 70 million years in the making, this mutualism, and I played no part, so let me have this fake violence. And of course, I'm already full of insects, not escamoles, because I'm too chicken shit, but instead the legs ground into flour, baked into bread. The banana muffin I left on the counter and was found first by the housefly. The hundreds of gnats I've inhaled and snorted since moving to Georgia 9 years ago. The fig is sex, and the pollen is sex, and the wasp is sex. When the male wasp hatches inside the fig, he tries to mate with the female wasp inside the fig, who is his sister, which is sex. He tunnels out and dies. She follows and lives. There's a metaphor somewhere in the fig wasp, but there's still no wasp in the fig. Not these common ones that I buy at the market with a gleaming formica floor. So I buy a fig tree at the nursery and plant it in the backyard. I wait for fig wasps, though I don't think they'll show up. And at night I dream that the wasps find their way to my figs, that each mouthful crunches with the carcass of wasp, that my mouth is both sweetness and sting. Thank you very much.
That was awesome. I love that there were two poems about fig wasps in a single reading. And I was thinking, it reminded me, hearing, I think it was, a week or so ago, that the ivory-billed woodpecker is not actually extinct. And my thought was, that little Twitter meme of like, don't tell the poets are going to come after, anytime there's interesting science news, go, don't tell the poets. So I think we're ready to kind of move into conversation mode. We've got another 15 or 20 minutes together. So I would like to say to anybody, out there in Zoom land, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat or the Q&A. But I have a few questions. First of all, are we all racing to write that ivory-billed woodpecker poem? Is the first one. I'm not sure that I am. I don't think I have that one in me. You guys can unmute yourselves, feel free, unless you have strange noises in the background. We have a neighbor who likes to fly. He has a personal flying machine that he goes up. It looks like a lawnmower with a parasail attached to it.
Yeah.
As Christina was reading, he fired up his portable flying. I think he's got more money than he knows what to do with. But luckily he has sailed off in the other direction now. So I was curious, I know Diamond and I both, firmly embrace the "I am not a nature poet," but statement. What do you all think? What is the biggest challenge to writing about nature?
Okay, so This is my multi-part question. Okay, so first tradition, right? Okay, that's the thing that when I ask my students, like, what is poetry? And we're just like slapping stuff on the board, somebody's always gonna say like flowers and stuff, right? Okay. And so for a while, there's this fantastic poem by Aziza Barnes, where it's like, my dad asks, why can't poets just write about flowers? And it's kind of this incredible poem that's thinking about the urgency of the kind of political moment and what's happening with Black bodies around the country, right? And how it's impossible for me to kind of use about flowers because I got other more urgent shit to deal with. And so I think for a while I was sort of subscribing to that, like I have urgent shit to deal with. And now I'm in a place where I'm thinking a little bit more about joy and about healing and about recovery. And now for some weird reason, I'm going back to the plants. What is it about plants, right? What is it about nature that says healing to me? I don't know. I don't have a green thumb. I have a cactus. That's the only thing I've had that survived, right? I don't know what it is about that landscape that's equaling healing to me, but I think a part of it is because I'm thinking about, it's so funny, Sean, that you talked a little bit about the Great Migration in one of your poems, right? I'm thinking about my grandmother, right? A big part of my project is thinking about how my grandmother like fled the South, right? And ended up coming back. And what it's like for me to be literally in the heart of where my grandmother grew up, right? To be back in that landscape. And what this means in terms of a generational healing, right? And so I guess there is something about nature that's opening up this kind of idea of healing, but more importantly, generational healing that I'm trying to contend with. But that's me.
I love that answer. Yeah. No, I mean, I think part of like my question, your question sort of has this like idea of like what nature is and how we write about it in part too. And like I had that moment when you're like, I'm not a nature poet. Years ago when Camille Dungeon's like, I'm putting together this Black nature thing and I want poems, you got these poems. I was like, Mom, I didn't know I was a nature poet, Camille. Like, what are you talking about? She's like, no, we got to reframe how we think about these things and talk about these things, because there's ways in which the framing excludes us. And we need to push against that. And so it's like, oh, that's okay. I'm on board with that. Let's get that together. Which was basically like me following her, going like, yeah, yes, you are incredibly astute there. And when you talk to students too about like nature poems, it's like, well, there's the pastoral tradition, which was basically like trying to glorify and talk about like rural life from like the point of view of city poets, right? I mean, way back when. And then it's like, well, we're gonna write some nature poems, because now we have like people who have the wherewithal to go out into nature. And now we're in the space where we talk about eco poems, where like we realize, oh, we're all in this house together, this planet. Eco from the Greek, orchis from oikos, like the yogurt, for like house, right? Yeah. And so like we're all in this house together, and that's like sort of gets back around to your question, like what is nature poetry? And I don't think of myself particularly exactly as a nature poet. I think I'm more kind of thinking of myself as an eco poet, if anything, because I'm thinking about the household and the generations that have been in this house, if that makes sense. So the history of this place and all of our neighbors, not just us, and however we talk about us, but like the white-headed woodpecker is out here too, right? So that's kind of where I am with it. Does that make sense, Chelsea? Like,
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking too of Diamond saying that once she resisted nature writing about flowers because you said, I have urgent shit to deal with. I think right now, Sean, your comment, we're all in this house together. We all have urgent shit to deal with, you know, right? The calamitous, changes to the environment.
Right.
Yeah, I personally have just always really bristled at the idea of, the stereotype of the poet kind of like wandering off in the woods and being visited by inspiration, you know, and then sitting and typing the pretty little things, because I've just always felt like that stereotype doesn't account for work. You know, that this is the craft, you know, the work of what we do of shaping. And I that kind of idea of the poet like sitting by the stream and waiting to be inspired is always, I think, just just found that fascinating.
And I was going to say, you know, I mean, my take on it is always like, I'm always defining it as, well, I try to write scientifically accurate fact into poetry, because for me, I think the other problem I get into, or the thing that, you know, just bothers me because I'm a pedantic, small-minded, is I hate when writers like anthropomorphize things. Like they look at a squirrel and they're like, that squirrel's having a bad day, right? Which is such a like selfish human pile of shit to put on a squirrel that's just like trying to dig up all my tulips or whatnot. You know, I think it's just kind of, you know, so like for me, the parameter is always like, okay, well, this is actually like the hard scientific fact about this mastodon. So now your job is to make art out of it, which is hard, right? It's much harder than just kind of like pretending that the mastodon, like if it were alive today, you know, would love, I don't know, like K-pop or something, right? Like just kind of like using it as like this incredibly shallow thing to project my stuff onto. And one of the really neat things that came out of writing this book and the company of paleontologists is like, they did not do this. I did this entirely to myself, but I was just like scared. I didn't want to borrow and then kind of bastardize their research. You know what I mean? Like this is their life's work. And I didn't want to be that poet who's like, tra la 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 la. But like, what if mastodons like wore funny hats and we just don't know it, you know? And they're like, no, there's nothing in the scientific record that supports that. You are an idiot. And this is why we don't let people like you into our conferences, you know? So yeah, but it's just, you know, the art is, I think, keeping to the fact of the science and not just kind of turning nature into whatever we as humans want it to mean.
We have a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm sorry out there. I'm having to lean in really far. I have very, very bad eyesight. I'm going to see if I can read. Here's a question for all the poets. Do you find that focusing on one subject, biblical stories, birds and mastodons respectively, has given you more poems or more in-depth poems? So they're asking a sort of quantity versus quality sort of logic. So specifically the idea, I suppose, of having, you know, so often poets were guided by a particular project, you know, particular kind of subject matter. Has that brought you to more poems in terms of quantity or more in-depth poems?
It's a good question, Robin. I see you. I mean, my answer is just yes, it depends. 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. What I did appreciate about working on a chapbook project that was all linked was that in that case, it felt very organic because of, you know, a lot of paleontology is like returning to fragments and trying to figure out what fragments mean and putting together the story. And then, you know, in paleontology, you sometimes realize that you put the specimen wrong, like you put it together wrong. And so it's called a reconstruction error, which I think is a phrase that all writers should use because it just, you know, like what is revision if not correcting the reconstruction errors? Yeah, so that was really helpful. It also let me kind of figure out what the larger thing I wanted to say about mastodons was. And spoiler alert, if you've read anything else I've written, turns out it's about my dad, you know, so yeah.
I think it's a quality thing for me, not a quantity. I mean, there are always birds, which is why, I mean, it's about what we're attuned to, what we observe, right? I grew up like the kid who was always staring out the window and not getting my work done soon enough. I'm still that person, and birds are always catching my attention as is other parts of the natural world and as the human world. Like I'm easily distracted. And right now there's a downy woodpecker I can hear like at the telephone pole, like at the corner. So for me, it's, I mean, I can sort of like, I want to make a assignment for myself to write about all the birds, blah, blah, that I hear in a day or something like that. But I mean, mostly it's about sort of the quality of the poem and where I can go and think about nature in the poem, I suppose. I did have a project once where I wrote postcard poems because I was traveling and I was like, whenever I see a bird, I'm going to write a poem for a friend. Mostly it's sort of a quality thing in a way of like how to think about where I am.
I'm having a hard time saying it's about quality with my work, and that might be the imposter in me that I'm ignoring. I think for me, having a particular subject is mostly like having the kind of net, right, to fall back on. I'm kind of out here trying to do acrobatic tricks in my poems, right? And when I feel like I'm about to slip, fall, my hands get sweaty, whatever that is, right? I have the kind of biblical stories to fall back on, right? And to say that like this project is a project of biblical stories is incredibly misleading on my part, my bad. Because it really is just kind of thinking a lot about subjectivity, in particular my grandmother, right? Thinking about who she was. She was an incredibly religious woman, right? But also thinking about the kind of downfalls of that, right? That sometimes my grandmother ascribed to this really kind of biblical idea of who she was supposed to be as a woman, and often different obstacles in her life didn't allow her to achieve that particular goal, right? She had a husband who was always gone. She had a society that often doesn't look at Black women as women, right? And often kind of ascribes them to either sexual creatures, period, right? So sexual objects, or even the kind of like emasculating masculating language of, for instance, like descriptions of, I'm thinking about Serena Williams immediately, right? And the ways that she gets described. Anyway, so I'm thinking about all these things and juggling all these things. And so if I'm saying like I'm focusing on biblical stories, what I'm really saying is I'm focusing on biblical stories plus, right? And it's staying open to the plus, staying open to, because if I think about just biblical stories, my scope is too small, right? I'm also thinking about Apocrypha. I'm also thinking about gardening. I'm also thinking about, what is it? Mountains, like all of these things, right? It's all over the place. All of these things can kind of be held within this idea, right? Whether or not that creates quantity over quality, that's neither here nor there, but it is.
I hear you. And I think when I said quality, I wasn't saying like it's good quality. I'm just saying it adds a certain quality for me.
You should say quality, though. You should.
As opposed to like, oh, I write about birds, I'm just write a whole bunch of bird poems. It's like, no, there's the birds like give a certain quality to the poem, like a way in which I can engage one more thing in the poem, that quality. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm with you.
We heard you, Sean. We hear you shilling your manuscript. Quality bird poems by Sean Hill.
I've got another question from the audience. And this is a question about, I think it touches on home and place. So thank you so much for reading. As a Georgia native who is living in Louisiana for grad school, I'm finding so much contrast in the local flora and fauna, as well as different levels of accessibility to nature. How does living in different places through your lives affect your perceptions / feelings about nature and nature writing? That is a good question. I was saying when we were chatting before the reading tonight, how I went from a number of years ago living in an urban area, living in Atlanta, to living in the rural North Georgia mountains. And I think that's where my take on nature poetry got distinctively darker, much darker than just because I was feeling this incredible sense of isolation. It felt a little bit at times like The Shining, the area where we were living, everybody around us lived in Florida, and they had these vacation homes. And so in the winter, our little road was just pitch black, and it was just our house, and there were all kinds of things out of the woods. But I want to turn this question over to the rest of you. How has living in different places affected your perceptions of nature and nature writing? Sean, you've been all over.
Yeah, I've been all over. I grew up in Milledgeville, which is a small town. But like when I grew up there, it was just Milledgeville is what I knew, right? And so Milledgeville is sort of my bedrock, like where everything's compared to Milledgeville. That's where my perception started. And it's it's in Georgia, it's in the Piedmont, it's like humid and there's things crawling around, and I grew up like crawling around with them, like poking at, like catching frogs and lizards and stuff, and like beetles, and just I was that kid. And I think I thought about nature sort of that way. Like I wanted to be a vet when I grew up. My favorite show was like all the nature shows, like Mutual of Omaha, Wild Kingdom, all that stuff. I was in it. And I kind of kept that like attentiveness to nature like throughout, but like ecosystems, ecotones, like things change and shift, and so you have to figure out where to look for things when you move places. And like I moved to Athens, it was a little different. I was like, oh, this is where this other stuff is now, and I have different access to things. And like thinking about accessibility, I mean, part of that is like, what's your financial situation? Like how are you in this place as a person? It's changed from location to location, being a man, being a woman, being a person of color, those kinds of questions show up. But I got out and went to the North Georgia mountains and went hiking when I lived in Athens. And then Houston, it's like, oh, if I look wherever water collects, if I kind of look down, I'll see something. Because like Houston's basically a swamp that was drained, right? And then moving to Alaska, moving to Montana, you look in different places for what to find the thing you want to find in the environment. And it has changed. It does change like how you perceive and think about things, nature, and it does affect, I guess, the nature writing in some ways too. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I moved around a lot too, and I think one of the ways it shaped me is I haven't found the place yet that has all the things I want, So it's like now I'm in Southeast Georgia and I have a house and I put plants in the ground, and that's like zone 8B, which means like some of my favorite Midwestern upstate New York plants are, like lilacs or like peonies. They're like never gonna make it down here. They're just like, no, they like stop somewhere around the Piedmont. But then when I go up north, like I can't, like I can romanticize the prairie, but when I go back to Minnesota, I'm suddenly reminded of how oppressive all that openness is. I was like, where are my large trees? Like I need some forest. I need the pine needles to get really hot and then smell the way they do in July, like they do. And so it's kind of like you were saying, all these little markers of like, it's nice too, because I think when you pay attention to things in nature, you will always be able to recognize things that are familiar that are mixed in with things that are very unfamiliar, right? And like that's like a kind of fancy way of just being like, pay attention. But I'm married to somebody who like would not be able to identify any species of tree. He's got a bunch of other really good qualities, but if I'm like, oh, did you see what this oak is doing? He's like, what that one? And I'm like, no, that's a pine tree, man. Like, so, but like different writers pay attention to different things, so.
I'm cheating because I'm not going to leave the South. I'm allergic to snow, and I need barbecue. Like if I don't have good barbecue, I can't survive. So I think I'm stuck with the South forever. But within the South, I've been really kind of transient. I mean, I lived in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, right? And now I'm in North Carolina. So we're hopping around. It's cute. When I'm thinking about when I was thinking about your question, one of the things that I was thinking about is, I mean, I feel like I'm a Southerner through and through, but my parents are very much New Yorkers, right? And I was, born to New Yorkers, and we used to kind of take trips up to New York when I was a kid, and it was fun, cute for a visit or whatever. But I remember on the drive home, because we always drove, on the drive home, getting intensely excited when I recognized the trees, right? The trees were like my way of understanding home, right? And there's something I think about landscape and home that's still heavily tied to me, right? And so that when I see something that feels distinctly Southern to me, or feels distinctly like Georgia to me, that feels distinctly like home, right? I have this kind of immediate sort of intimacy created with the landscape and back, right? And memories start opening up and all of these things, right? So I think that's a little bit about how, I don't know, living in these different places. The trees here in North Carolina are mad cute. It's so lush and green and wonderful, right? It's really surreal to be living in a place that's beautiful all the time. Like I just walk outside the door, see the mountains in the distance, and I'm like, oh, that's wild, right? People live like this. Wow. I didn't think that was something that I could have. To have this kind of accessibility to nature, like you were describing in your question, is just wild to me. Because again, like I grew up mostly in kind of like Georgia, right? Decatur, DeKalb, Gwinnett, Marietta, right? Like hopping all over. And even now my family has kind of fled Atlanta a little bit. My mom's out in Macon now, basically. But we still, it's not quite like this kind of abundance of nature. I'm not used to that. And so
Where are you?
I'm in Asheville.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
So I think you're getting at this thing I was talking about earlier, like with the rural urban thing, right? Because you're like in Georgia, but like you talking about Atlanta, I'm talking about Milledgeville. That's different. And like, and I love when you because I lived in Statesboro, I miss it. It was as close to Milledgeville as I'd gotten for like ecotone, like since, or an ecosystem since like living in Milledgeville, like and I was like, when I got there, I was like, oh, this smells like home. And there, but like on steroids, because there were like tons of box turtles and like so many snakes and stuff. And I was like, I don't remember that like 2 hours north of there. We didn't have it quite like this. Like the humidity or whatever just like amped everything. All like the herpa life was like in full effect. And I was like, awesome. And like the insect life. And I was just like, this place is great. And so it was like all of that. And then, I moved to Montana. It's like, we don't have that exactly anymore, like this in the same way. It's a different thing. I don't have the same trees, but I do have like, oh, look over there, you see some mountains, so I'm like, but there's this way in which like the urban and the rural also, like we have these ideas, these lines we've drawn on maps, and these places we built, and these places, and we call it Georgia, but it's not all Georgia the same way. And Asheville is not all of North Carolina, but it's pretty awesome.
It's pretty nice.
Yeah. Sorry, I was like, I got excited.
It was exciting.
I've got one more question that came into the chat, and then we should wrap up. So I just say one thing first. I'm going to post in the chat as they're talking. I have if anyone wants a writing prompt, I have one that I like to give people, and that is essentially to write an anti-nature poem. And so I'm going to put that in the chat. And you all, if you have other prompts, other suggestions for poems that you want to give people, feel free to do that. But the last question we have is, do you have any thoughts about form and writing about place? And also, it's a two-parter, so we can answer either part. Also, how has writing about nature allowed you to talk to other subjects, family, father, fatness, etc.? And why do you think it has opened that door? In other words, nature, landscape, sort of as a entryway into the other subject. And Sean Hill has a prompt as well. Perfect. Great. I'm going to post one as well.
it depends on the subject, but I will say, you know, one of the things that I have this talk that I give where I kind of talk about what I've identified as like 5 functions that scientific fact can play in poetry and creative nonfiction. But one of the things, like just one of them is, I think the scientific fact lets me come at the subject at an angle. You know, so if I'm writing, I mean, I end up writing a lot about, you know, my kind of nearly estranged father. And it's, you know, it's been years now, but it's painful. And so if I start a poem with like the honeybee thermal defense mechanism, right? Usually that kind of gets the poem going. And then from there, I can figure out like the metaphor. And, you know, I'm not looking at like the painful thing straight on. I'm looking at the honeybees. And then of course it's like, oh, well, what are they doing? And so that's one of the things that I think is really helpful, you know. Camilla Anisio has like great line where she says like, the more white hot something is, the more like necessary coldness you need when you write about it. And that's what I kind of think the science does. It like tempers down. Not the science isn't emotional and wonderful and has all the emotions, it does, but it also kind of gives a balance to the poem so that I'm not just coming in real hot, like with my sad dad poem, you know. It's more like, and here are some fun facts about how bees work. So, yeah.
I think for me, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about like the connection between nature and fatness to me, because that is, that's what I care about, right? I got my PhD recently, and it's in African American poetics and fat studies, right? So any opportunity I can get to talk about fatness, I'm here, right? Okay, so I think there's a really close tie between nature, poetry as a genre, right, and fatness. Right, and we have these instincts and all of these to cull, basically, to kind of force into concision, to focus into smallness, right? So poetry, right, a lot of the language that we use to describe poems, talking about trim the fat, talking about kind of making the poem a little bit more concise. Poetry is kind of supposed to embrace the sense of smallness, right? And so it's automatically a kind of like anti-fat rhetoric that's kind of inherent in poetry, right? Same goes with nature. Right, and thinking about the relationship we have with nature, the desire to cull, the desire to kind of manicure, the desire to kind of hold back, right? It all seems to be very much rooted in anti-fatness, right? And to me, right, poetry is at its most beautiful when it's breaking the boundaries of poetry, right? Nature is at its most beautiful when it's allowed to be kind of unfettered and beautiful and wild and lush, right? And fatness is fantastic, right? And so it's allowing me to kind of explore all of these beautiful manifestations of excessiveness, right? And I think we're often taught that being excessive is a bad thing, right? Especially because excessive is an adjective, again, often attributed to fat folks, Black folks, women, anybody who kind of exists out of the cis heteronormative patriarchal idea of what's proper, right? And so anytime we get to kind of embrace and explore the kind of excessive, right? I'm here for it.
Yeah.
That is awesome. That is an awesome answer.
Ah.
I'm gonna go listen to like 8 episodes of Maintenance Phase when I'm done.
Like I can't say anything now. I should have just jumped in before. Like,
I was excited.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, yeah. I think the question was also asked about like form or something like that, and I mean I think like poetry is also like it's everything you both have said, and also I think it's about connection and stuff. And so like the nature gives me another thing to connect to, like it gives me another thing to think about emblematically, symbolically, or cinematically, or like metaphorically. I can like sort of figure out ways of making connections to things. And in terms of form, I mean, like forms is sort of qualitative thing, right? Like how do we like manage like certain number of feet or like rhyme scheme or whatever, that can be generative, but like it's just sort of, but that's also a kind of connecting too, like you're connecting these different things together. So it's always like trying to figure out how things connect, which I think goes back to the prompt I put in, like how do we connect with nature? How do we connect our story with that story if we're going to think about these different stories, right? Which is what I was doing with the White-Headed Woodpecker poem and the Lake Sturgeon poem. It's like, how did this story their lives? Because, you know, if something can live to be 150 years old, like it would have seen the Civil War. Like what is that? And also to think like the Civil War was only 150 years ago. It's not that long ago. And here we are. You earlier talked about climate and environment, and I would think about those words too. It's like, Chelsea, one way of thinking about climate for me is also thinking about the political climate that I'm living in. And, you know, environment is not just the nature that is the world that is non-human for me. Like the environment is very much the human environment that I live in too. And so those connections have to come into, for me at least, as the person that I am in the world, have to come into play in my poems. Maybe not every poem, but yeah, very often, if that makes sense.
Makes great sense. But this has been such a pleasure. I could stay on this screen with you all night, having these conversations, but it is time for us to wrap up. So if you are out there, Sean and I both posted a couple of prompts for maybe ways of finding your way into a poem. I think another just very general kind of maybe a fun prompt would be to begin a poem with a sentence, "I'm not a nature poet, but," you know, maybe try to write a poem of maybe praise, maybe write an ode that begins, "I'm not a nature poet, but." That might be a fun way. Thanks again to the Georgia Center for the Book for hosting this. And thank you to all of the readers, Diamond, Sean, Christina. Your work is so amazing. If you are in Georgia, please check out georgiapoetryintheparks.org. Better yet, go out into nature and find the poems out in the wild. They're at Arabia Mountain and the Michelle Obama Trail in DeKalb. And they will be coming other places where we hope to spread poetry across Georgia. So thanks again.
Thank you all so much. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.